Building cabinetry the right way can save a ton of time and headaches down the road. So today I want to share every secret I wish I knew when I got started, all while building an heirloom piece. So let's get to work on Timber Biscuit. Over the years, I've tried every trick in the book to make furniture that will last forever, or at least long enough to pass it down a few generations. So today I want to dive into all those details that have really saved me a lot of time and money, and most importantly, my sanity. Oh, and there's a few safety ones in there too, so that's always a plus. So for this piece, I'm going to be using 4/4 walnut and 4/4 white oak. And what you see me doing here is breaking down my walnut. Now, normally I start a project by breaking down all my lumber. But with this project, I had to kind of do things out of order because my lumber supplier was fresh out of white oak when I started the project. So that forced me to break up the milling process a bit, which actually ended up being a good thing, and I'll talk about why in a little bit. To get started, you saw me breaking down my lumber using a jigsaw. And I prefer using a jigsaw to cut my rough lumber to rough length, because with rough lumber, you never know what kind of tension or twists there are in the board, and using a miter saw can lead to kickback. From there, I'll head over to the planer to skip plane my boards. And we'll talk a little bit more about skip planing later on in the video. But for now, let's take a step back and look at the design. So this little cabinet is going to feature a ton of different woodworking techniques. And though overall it's a really simple design, executing that simple design is a little bit tricky. So for this video, we're going to be focusing on the upper and lower portion of the casework, both of which have a couple different shelves as well as doors that all need to fit together for this piece to work. And when it comes to cabinetry like this, we want to make sure everything's perfectly square. So with that goal in mind, let's pick things back up with the lower carcass. So back over at the joiner, I went ahead and jointed one clean edge on all my freshly planed boards. And once I have one clean edge, I can take these boards over to the table saw to clean up the other side. Now when it comes to making cabinets, there's a couple different options. You can either go the hardwood route, which I'm doing with this one, or you can go the plywood route, which I've done in plenty of videos in the past. And there's a few different reasons as to why you might go one way or the other. Generally speaking, building things out of plywood is going to be a little bit cheaper than building them out of hardwood. But technically speaking, building with hardwood can be a little bit more forgiving when it comes to actually assembling the piece. And that's because with hardwood, you don't have to worry about those paper-thin veneers you see with some plywoods. What plywood gives you is a very stable material that isn't going to move over time. Whereas working with hardwood, you have to take wood movement into consideration at every corner. So while both are a viable option, there's a bit of give and take there, and ultimately you just have to decide which works best for your piece. I'd say the only other downside of using hardwood is that you have to build all your panels, which can get a little redundant. It's just like the fine line between a numerator and a denominator. Only a fraction of people understand this. So with my boards all ripped down to their maximum capacity, or maximum width, I could then lay out my grain pattern. And once I found the grain orientation I liked, I went ahead and took the boards back over to the joiner to do the in-out method. And that's where you mark one edge of your board with I's and the adjoining edge with O's, and face those I's and O's in or out towards the fence while you joint them at the joiner. This creates two perfectly parallel edges so that when you glue the boards up, they align exactly. Now I've used this process on dozens of pieces and it works fantastically. But I recently picked up a number 7 joiner plane and I started using that on this build, and I gotta tell you that I love those results even more. Because the number 7 has a really long body, it really creates a nice flat edge against those boards, and the glue seam from the number 7 is nearly invisible. So while the in-out method is a perfectly viable option, from here on I'll probably be using the number 7. Now I should clarify that the walnut I'm using here is only going to be for the exterior of the lower case. The interior parts will be made from the white oak, so it'll give it a pop of color when you open the cabinet. The next step in the process was to go ahead and lay out my domino joinery. Now I'm using dominoes in these boards because they're just a hair over 3/4 of an inch. And I say a hair because I left them a little thick so that I could sand back to that 3/4 of an inch later on. If these boards were an inch or more in thickness, I'd probably omit the dominoes altogether, but that also depends on the board's overall flatness. So because this is going to be the outside carcass, I don't have to worry too much about the domino placement. If I cut into any of the dominoes when I'm building the cabinet, they're just going to end up inside of the joints, so you're never going to see them. The only other thing I had to take into consideration was the orientation of my top and right side, because for that section, I'm going to have a wraparound miter. So that's where working with the domino really helps keep things aligned. Kind of like the sponsor for today's video. On April 17, 2019, or 5 years ago this month, I decided to change my life and stop drinking. And that wasn't easy, as I've been dependent on alcohol for years and often found every reason I could to consume it. But with a lot of hard work and assistance from my therapist, I was able to work through my underlying issues and find healthier and more productive outlets. And through my sobriety, I found a whole new outlook on life, and I owe a great deal to my family and therapists. The moral of this story is that asking for help when you need it can truly change your life. My therapist helped me work through years of alcohol dependence and the underlying issues driving my behavior, and I know many people struggle with similar issues. So if you feel you could benefit from speaking to a professional, I want to tell you about BetterHelp, the sponsor for today's video. BetterHelp makes therapy accessible and convenient with phone, video, and messaging options. After taking a questionnaire, you'll get matched with a licensed therapist in under 48 hours in most cases. Plus, you can switch therapists easily if needed. See if online therapy is right for you by visiting betterhelp.com/timberbiscuit or choosing TimberBiscuit at sign-up for 10% off your first month of therapy. Asking for help was life-changing for me, and it can be for you too. So with my 4 panels out of clamps, I could go ahead and trim them down to their final width. And as always, I say final width loosely here because I'm actually trimming these down to about a 32nd of an inch over their final width. And that's because I want to leave a little wiggle room to hand plane down the face edges once the cabinet is fully assembled. And that might sound like a lot of extra work, but it only takes a minute. Though I guess the length of that minute really depends on which side of the bathroom door you're on. Next, I could set up a sled at the table saw to cut the miters for the cabinet. Now, when cutting miters on hardwood, I like to try to nail 45 degrees. If I was using plywood, I might do 44.9 degrees to make sure the outside of my miter lines up perfectly, and I would do that because I could conceal that hairline gap with edge banding. But again, since I'm using hardwood, I want to try to nail those miters as best I can. Now, cutting miters on a 20-inch wide board like this can be kind of tricky. So if you don't have a sled that's deep enough to cut the miters at the table saw, you would just need to use something like a track saw or a circular saw with a straight edge. And with that in mind, I'd love to hear what you guys are using in your own shops. Let me know down in the comments if you prefer a circular saw or table saw for long miters. And as always, if you start your comment with circular saw or table saw, I'll reply to you guys first because I know you're paying attention. So with my 2 side pieces cut down to their final length, I can then cut 1 miter along the edge of the top panel. Then from there, I can go ahead and mark out the final length for that piece. I don't mark the final length out in the center of the board. Instead, I think it's a lot more accurate to reference the edge I just cut. This makes nailing that overall length a whole lot easier. From there, I can take the workpiece back over to the saw and cut the second miter. Now, to make sure both my boards are exactly the same length, what I'll first do is cut 1 miter onto my bottom piece, then align those miters and transfer the marking onto my second board. This ensures that both my boards are exactly the same length, and best of all, it requires no measuring. Anytime throughout a project that you can reference off your existing workpiece, it's a good idea to do so, because there's no telling if something has shifted while you've cut, or if your lengths are spot on. And that's going to be especially true for cabinet work. If you're off on one section of a cabinet and then you try to align it with the next, those mistakes tend to compound and you're going to have a whole lot of parts that are out of whack. It's much easier to adjust on one mistake than it is to try to go back and fix 5. Which is exactly why when you see me laying out my stopped dados here, I'm only laying out the dados on one of my workpieces. Then from there, I'll align my workpieces and transfer those markings onto my second. This way my dados are mirror images of one another. And if I make a mistake 1/64th one way or another, that mistake is the same on both my boards, and that means that my casework will still be perfectly square. And if you're enjoying these tips and you're finding them helpful, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the video out, and trust me when I say you don't want to miss the next one. So with my router settings all locked in, I could go ahead and plow the stopped dados. So here what I'm going to do is clamp my mirroring workpieces together and cut those dados at the same time. This again cuts down on the number of mistakes that could occur and ensures that the top and bottom dados will meet up at the same place. When aligning my router to my markings, I like to use my track saw guide rail to keep things straight, but any straight edge would work. Then from there I'll drop my bit down to the workpiece and give it a spin in the opposite direction of the twist. This way I don't tear up the workpiece, but it gives me an indication as to where the bit is located. If I need to make any fine adjustments, I can do so right or left, and then from there I can plow the dados. Now in these dados I'm using an upcut bit because they're going to be hidden anyway, so I'm not too worried about any tear out that might occur. But when cutting dados that don't have a shoulder, you'll want to use a downcut bit for a nice clean top edge. Next I can go ahead and pop a few mortises into my miters. Now this isn't completely necessary for any casework, but I find it a lot easier to assemble large pieces like this when there are a couple dominoes in the miters. The dominoes aren't doing a whole lot to increase the strength of the miter joint, but instead they're helping me to align those pieces and hold them in place during assembly. Just be careful to use your domino on its lowest setting and set the fence to about 5mm if you're going to do this, so you don't plunge your mortise through the backside of your workpiece. Ask me how I know about that trick. So with the outside casework complete, I could go ahead and get started on my interior parts. Now again here, I'm going to go ahead and mill all my parts down to just over 3/4 of an inch. And luckily I had just enough white oak from other projects left over in the shop to be able to work on my interior parts, because at this point in the project I was still waiting on my rift sawn white oak. But since these parts are going to live on the interior of the case, they're only going to really be seen when the cabinet doors are open, so I'm okay with using just plain sawn white oak for those parts. Plus doing so saves me a couple bucks, and I'm all for that. And because these are shorter boards, during the joining process, I can double them up and joint both boards at one time, which will save me some time. I think that's really something to take into consideration when you're building a piece. If you can save yourself a few dollars or a couple hours of work, then I say go for it. It's not sacrificing anything on the design or build quality, and I'd argue that it's being more resourceful. So when it comes to assembling the panels, what I first like to do is pop in my dominoes and then add glue to one side of my joint. Then from there I'll pop my boards together, and if I need to, I can use those clamps to squeeze that joint tight so the joinery is not loose while I'm doing the assembly. Next I'll place a few clamps along the top side to distribute that clamping pressure evenly. When necessary, I'll throw on a caul or two and then check for flatness, and if we're good, we carry on. If not, I'll add another caul. With the panels out of clamps, I can next rip them down to their final width. Again, I'll err on the side of these panels being slightly too wide, so I can hand plane them down to their final width later on. Next, I'll give all my dominoes a quick shave for my outer carcass. Since I use the shallowest mortise depth for the miters, the standard domino size is just a little too long, so I just trim those down at the bandsaw and then assemble the case. From there I'll measure to get the final length for my 2 vertical partitions, as well as my 2 shelves. Then I'll head over to the table saw and trim those down. Now just like before, I'm going to take these measurements off my casework. Though I do have these measurements in my plan, it's a lot smarter to take your internal dimensions off your workpiece. This way again, if anything has shifted, you can make those adjustments on your panels. And you'll have to forgive me because I completely forgot to ask you guys if you wanted plans for this project, and if you do, just let me know down in the comments, and as always, if there's enough interest, I'll put them together. Alright, so with my spinning discs of death all set up on my table saw, as well as my sacrificial fence, I could go ahead and cut the shoulders from my dados into the panels. Now right off the table saw, I like to leave these a little proud so that I can use a shoulder plane to really clean those shoulders up and get them nice and tight. I want the dados to be pretty snug, but not so snug that I have to use a mallet to tap them in place. And that's because once I apply glue to this joint, it's going to swell a little bit, and it's going to make it even tougher to get these panels in place. From there I can use a scrap piece to help me transfer the dado location from the side of the cabinet to the interior vertical partition. Doing it this way ensures that the shelf is correctly placed on those vertical partitions, and that again, everything stays square. I think best of all, it doesn't take any math or real measuring to transfer the dado. And I love simple solutions like this. Yep, it makes me proud of my shelf. Gosh, that's a terrible joke. So with the dados for the shelves cut in place, I could go ahead and repeat the entire process for the shelf panels. Now this is one of those order of operation things that you just can't really get away from. Unfortunately, the only real way to get a good fit on the shelves is to go ahead and reset and redo everything I just did. And what you'll notice about pieces like this is that's pretty much the trend. When you finish up one part, you have to go back and take your measurement and then rework the next part. And it's really important to stick with the order of operations. If you try to cut corners, no pun intended, it's going to come back to bite you. So with the panels fitting well, it was time to notch out the shoulders for the stop dados. And to do that, I'm just going to use my bandsaw and a magnetic stop. Once I have the stop set up, it's easy to make those repeatable cuts. Here, I'm just sure to leave about 1/2 millimeter on the edge so that I can chisel everything down nice and flush. Decilingual. When you are using a chisel to clean up the notches on your shoulders, just be careful not to overcut your joint. It'll be pretty obvious if you do, and there'll be a gap where the notch meets the edge of the panel. Here, taking smaller, lighter cuts is much better than just one large one. From there, I could give the lower cabinet its first full dry assembly. And yeah, I'd say we nailed it. Next, it was time to go ahead and bury that dado stack into my sacrificial fence and cut the rabbets along the back side of the case. The rabbets here are going to be 1/4 inch wide and 3/8 of an inch deep, and that's so that I can fit a rear panel that's 1/4 inch thick in later on. And that rear panel is pretty important, because on a piece like this, that rear panel does a lot to prevent any racking. Plus on the upper portion, it'll help prevent sagging, which is important for the unsupported areas. So with the rabbets cut in place, I could turn my focus to the outside facing edges of the internal parts. And I'll just clean those up using a hand plane. Yep, there's nothing quite like the finish you'll get from a sharp plane iron. It's also at this point that I'll label my parts as well as mark their orientation to make things easier for the glue up. Now, longtime viewers of the channel know that I like to do a couple practice runs for my glue-ups before actually doing the real thing. And those dry runs really take the stress out of building casework. It's important to know where your clamps go beforehand so you're not tripping over yourself while the metaphorical timer is going. It's just like when I ate that clock. It was time consuming, but it was way worse when I went back for seconds. So with the lower case out of clamps, I could get started working on the upper portion, which was really excellent timing because while it was in clamps, the rift saw in white oak arrived. So here I'm going to break this down exactly like I did for the lower cabinet, where I use my jigsaw to rough cut everything, then run it through the planer. And since this is S2S lumber, or surface two sides, all I have to do is skip plane it. And all that means is that I'm going to run it through the planer, taking light passes on each side until I get to my final thickness. Now here I'm aiming for my thickness to be quite a bit over 3/4 of an inch, because these are going to be smaller panels that I'll run through the planer again once the panels are fully assembled. And that's a bit of a deviation from my earlier strategy. And the reason I'm able to do that is because my planer is 15 inches wide, so I won't have any trouble planing down the 14-inch wide panels. This is a solid strategy to use whenever your panels are smaller than your planer. And that's because if there's any deviation during the panel building process, it's going to get negated once I go ahead and plane everything down again. So doing it this way gives me a little bit more leeway. Now as those panels come out of clamps, all I have to do is take a light pass with the random orbit sander on one side of each of the boards. From there I can head over to the planer and plane them down to their final thickness. Here I am aiming for 3/4 of an inch, since this is the final time that I'll be thicknessing the boards down. And I really don't have to worry about removing any more material by sanding, since both sides of my glue lines will already be cleaned up. So with the panels thickness down, I could take them over to the table saw and rip them down to their oversized final width. Now the sides for the upper cabinet are also going to get miters. But these miters are only going to be on one end of the sides, since the bottom end is going to rest on top of the lower carcass. So trimming the sides down to final length is pretty straightforward. Where I really want to nail the cut is for the upper portion of the upper cabinet. I want that to be exactly the same width as my lower case. So to get that dimension, I'll again cut one miter on one end and get my final length directly off the lower carcass. The next step was to go ahead and lay out and cut the dados into my side panels, and since we've already done that a few times, I'm sure you guys are experts at this point, so we'll just kind of glaze over that. The real tricky part here is cutting those long internal pieces to their final length. So what I'm going to do here is use some 90-degree clamping squares to hold things, well, square, while I take the measurements for my final lengths. Now, I have a good idea of what this is supposed to be based off my other internal parts, as well as my plan, and a little bit of strategical guesswork. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these down to their final length, and I'm going to err on the side of them being a 32nd of an inch too long, which actually ended up working out perfectly. The only caveat is to really pay attention to the depth of your dados when working with workpieces this long, because dados can vary from dado to dado, and you want to try to be as consistent as possible. So if you can, when cutting dados for a cabinet, just set up your router once and then don't touch it again until all your dados are cut. Either way, it's always a good idea to go back with a router plane and just check to make sure all your dados are the same depth. That'll save you a lot of headaches when trying to fit those joints later on. To find the length for my final vertical support, I'm just going to use a really long jointed board stretched between my two sides. And then I can just test the fit with a 1/2-inch piece of scrap ply to make sure I have the right length. From there I can cut down my remaining boards to length, and then cut in the shoulders for my stopped dados. And while I wrap that up, let me take a quick moment to say that if you guys are enjoying the videos on this channel and you want to support the show, I'd like to invite you to join my Patreon. As I've mentioned before, I design, build, and shoot all these projects by myself on nights and weekends, so having the support from you guys really makes all this possible. Plus, membership gets you access to plans, discount codes, live chats, and behind-the-scenes access you just can't get with YouTube. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, check out the link down in the description. And if you can't join today, no sweat. Thanks for watching, liking, and sharing the videos, and just being a part of the community. And as always, to you guys who've already joined, thank you so much for your continued support. Your donations go directly towards making these videos, so thank you. Alright, let's wrap this up. So the next step was to go ahead and hand plane the front edges of all my work pieces. I'm going to end up doing this again with all my front facing edges, so I don't want to get there all the way. But for the parts that are going to be inset from the front, I want to make sure they're perfectly plain now, since accessing them later is going to be pretty difficult. The final step before the glue up was to go ahead and pop in my mortises for my top cabinet to attach to my lower cabinet. And for this portion, I'm going to be using Festool's connector hardware. What this will allow me to do is to remove the top portion of the cabinet from the lower cabinet when I need to move it around. All I have to do is plunge one side of the connector assembly into the base, then plunge the adjoining deeper mortises into the sides of my upper cabinet. When using the connectors, it's just really important to make sure that you're referencing off the same face. So for these parts, I'm referencing off the outside face. From there, I'll drill a hole into the interior side of the panel to make sure those connectors are as concealed as they can be. Now, if you want a deep dive on the connector system, be sure to check out the loft bed build I did a few months ago, where I talk more in depth about how this system works. Once I have the mortise and hole plunged, the hardware just drops in place and a small clip keeps everything aligned. The really cool thing about this hardware is that it works directly with the domino, and it makes building really large furniture more accessible to small shops like mine. A lot of people like to compare it to IKEA furniture, but really it's like IKEA furniture on steroids. Once I have the two sides in place, I can go ahead and clamp up my shelf so that I can mark out the location for my center vertical partition. When people are first getting started, they tend to try to mark out parts like this without referencing their actual workpiece. And sometimes you can get by doing that, but in my experience, that works about as good as a new towel. Yeah, there's just nothing quite like the oldies. The last step before the final glue up was to cut in the rabbets for the rear panels. Now, the rear panels on this piece are only going to exist behind the cabinet doors. So what that means is that I have to strategically place some of these rabbet joints. Since some of the rabbets will exist on one part and not on the other, I really had to take my time to make sure I didn't cut any rabbets in a section that didn't need one. And the router table really helps to control that start and stop point. But since I did have to start and stop those rabbets, there's a small section at the start and stop points that I did have to clean up with a chisel. And once I had all those parts cleaned up, I could go ahead and pop my rabbeting bit into my plunge router and route a small rabbet on the upper portion of the lower cabinet. This is going to overlap with the upper cabinet and conceal the rear panel once everything is assembled. The only downside is that with no dust collection, it makes quite a mess. Air hose for the win. From there, it was on to the final glue up. And for this glue up, I invited my wife into the shop to help me out since it's a pretty large glue up, and honestly any large glue up is just going to be easier when you have a partner in the shop. So if you have a friend, a neighbor, or a spouse, do something kind for them and hopefully they'll lend you a hand in the shop. With the glue dry, I could remove the clamps and use a block plane to clean up the fronts. And it's for this reason that I keep all my boards oversized even after the glue up, because with this type of casework, it's almost a guarantee that all your edges aren't going to line up perfectly. So giving yourself a little wiggle room to plane back is a really good idea. And with that, the casework chapter of this build is complete. So consider my secrets revealed. In the next video, I'll cover how to build shaker-style cabinet doors, including veneering some rift sawn white oak for the door panels, as well as turning a large portion of this white oak cabinet jet black. And the entire process behind achieving the best results for that are pretty surprising, so be sure to keep an eye out for that one. Until then, check out this video next, subscribe so you don't miss the next one, and as always, I knew this would work, and I'll see you next time.